Well, good morning, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's virtual launch of the Infrastructure WA State Infrastructure Strategy discussion paper. The launch of the discussion paper today is the first major report released by IWA since its establishment in July last year, and represents a critical step in the development of its 20-year vision for infrastructure in the state. I'm particularly pleased that Infrastructure Partnerships Australia can help begin the conversation about that vision today. Today's event will provide an opportunity to explore the unique infrastructure opportunities and challenges to be tackled in the strategy. We'll also discuss some of the potential implications of COVID-19 for infrastructure planning and prioritisation. I will be moderating a panel discussion to delve further into these issues shortly. For that panel discussion, I will be joined by John Langland, AO, Chairperson of Infrastructure WA, Nicole Lockwood, Deputy Chairperson of Infrastructure WA, Lance Blair, the Acting Chief Executive Officer of Infrastructure WA, and Marion Fulker, Board Member from Infrastructure Australia, which I think is collectively known as the iBody Royal Flush. After the panel discussion today, we'll have time for a facilitated Q&A where you can ask questions of our panellists. So first up, we're going to hear from John Langland, AO. John was appointed the Chair of Infrastructure WA in July 2019, having previously held the position of Chief Executive of Capital Equity, Australian Capital Equity, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry Western Australia, and the Oakajee Port and Rail Project. And John was, of course, also Under Treasurer of Western Australia. John, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Adrian. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for taking interest in the launch of Infrastructure WA's first discussion paper, and that concerns the development of the first ever 20-year strategy on infrastructure for Western Australia. The title of this paper, Planning for a Stronger Tomorrow, seems even more pertinent today in this COVID world than when we first conceived the title for the paper. So just looking at the first slide, the infrastructure strategy, or the creation of IWA, was designed to move infrastructure planning and delivery out of the political cycles. That we have an independent board established. It's structured in a way to ensure collaboration, strong independent representation on the board that will drive that capability, including through the inclusion of representatives from government. Importantly, the board answers to the Premier. As this slide shows, there's two major phases of work. The first, which is the focus of this discussion paper, is the 20-year strategy. And the whole approach to this strategy is about growing collaboration, about providing confidence to industry, to see the plans for infrastructure development across a medium term, ensuring maximum returns on government investment, creating a pipeline of construction projects and programs, considering the impact of policy and regulation on the development of infrastructure, especially private infrastructure, and most particularly building a stronger WA that can withstand whatever the future aims at us. So just turning to the next slide, the more strategic approach to infrastructure development has a structure to it. Clearly, the state infrastructure strategy is the foundation to the whole structure. After we complete the strategy, the government will develop a 10-year infrastructure program, which will be released, tabled in the Parliament. It's about improving the quality of the business case, particularly around the major projects. And Infrastructure WA will have a specific role for projects which exceed $100 million. And it's about providing greater transparency for projects through the annual budget process. And as the slide also mentions, working with Infrastructure Australia on ensuring a fair share of federal funding is available to projects across the state. Next slide, what is the state's infrastructure strategy? So in developing the strategy, we are intending to take a highly consultative approach. A draft plan will be issued around the middle of next year. The final plan, which we anticipate will be completed in the second half of 2021, will be tabled in the Parliament. Then the government's response to this plan will need to be made public. And the progress with the development of the plan that is decided on by the government from this process will be monitored annually by Infrastructure WA. So what's the strategy's remit? The Infrastructure West Australian Act applies to all West Australian government departments, all sub-departments, all statutory authorities, and all government trading enterprises. I like to think of it as anything that impacts the state's budget will be within our remit. The government must respond to the state infrastructure strategy recommendations with specific timelines, and state agencies, once the strategy has been agreed by government, will need to support the recommendations. There's no minimum amount of money in any infrastructure program which won't be in our attention. That is, there's no threshold amount. And of course, once we look across the remit of all that scope, prioritising programs and projects will be one of our key challenges. Not only are we going to look at the built form of infrastructure, but we also are required through the legislation to look at non-build aspects that impact on the development of infrastructure across the state. And the slide shows you or gives you an insight into the range of those non-build factors which we will be considering in developing this first 20-year strategy. In terms of the outlook, we are going to develop a methodology which will apply to the development of this first infrastructure strategy. There's 5 broad components to it: a baseline assessment of the existing infrastructure position, application of a framework that considers economic, social and environmental issues, strong stakeholder engagement. And in developing the 20-year strategy, we're going to take a hybrid approach to 2 phases of the strategy, particularly the phase 0 to 10 years, which will be building from the bottom. That is primarily, what do we know about the existing intentions for infrastructure and the key priorities that agencies identify and the community identify. And then in the second phase of the strategy, the period from 11 to 20 years, taking more of a top-down approach and using a scenario analysis to develop those top-down approaches, and clearly a range of macroeconomic aggregates will help to drive that scenario planning. In terms of the timeline, this chart shows you where we sit at the moment. The release of the discussion paper basically kicks off the process for the development of the 20-year strategy. As I mentioned earlier, we see the development of the strategy taking us at least 12 months, if not 18 months. We don't want to rush the development of the strategy. This is the first time it's been done in WA, and we are determined to ensure that we bring out a comprehensive document. So that's going to take a little bit of time. With the release of this discussion paper today, we're going to engage in an intensive 8-week consultation phase. And that consultation phase will complete around the 21st of August. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The discussion paper itself, I think you're probably being directed now as to where you will find the discussion paper, but our webpage is shown on the bottom of this slide. There are a number of key issues which we're seeking feedback on. Some of them are shown here, and we'll talk a little bit further about that later on. But if I can just draw a couple out, the objectives and the principles which we've developed within this discussion paper are critically important. the key challenges and opportunities across the different sectors which make up the WA economy. And in developing the strategy, we're going to consider the impact of technology, the impact of urbanisation and the shifting urban development patterns, changing behaviours and expectations across our community, environmental challenges and resilience of the economy, and economic efficiency. The chart, which you can see on the screen at the moment, shows you the 10 objectives which we've developed as being critical to the development of this first strategy. These 10 objectives are open to discussion. And as you can see, they cover a broad range of considerations. The impact on the economy is critically important. The impacts of the changing climate on infrastructure and community at large, the importance to support the Aboriginal well-being across our community is a significant objective for us. To ensure we have the right skills across our economy and skills that are available to deliver a program will be one of the key areas which we will focus on in developing the strategy so that we can ensure that the strategy is deliverable, and technology's role in the future, to name just a few of these top 10 objectives. And as I said, these are matters which we're seeking feedback on. The other key issue as we develop the strategy is how do we bring all of the priorities from across the regions, as the next chart shows. Western Australia has defined regions and they've been in place for a considerable period of time. And our community organises itself around the regions, and there are proud communities in all of our regions. What we want to do is engage with the whole state. We've already had an extensive range of visits across the regions, and in this next 8-week period, we're going to again visit all of the regions so that we have the opportunity of hearing from everybody across the state as to what the key priorities of their infrastructure needs are. In developing the strategy, our desire is to develop an infrastructure strategy which raises the economic, social and environmental benefits across the whole state. So in discussing the infrastructure needs of the individual regions, we're also wanting to have an engagement with those regions about how that infrastructure does indeed go to raise the economic, social and environmental benefits across the whole state, in addition to the regions. This is going to be quite an interesting part of the whole consultation phase, which we look forward to engaging in. Just coming back to the methodology, the next slide gives you a little more insight into how we're going to go about the methodology. The bottom-up approach works off, as I said a moment ago, what we know. That is, what's already in the infrastructure plan at the moment, what do we know about the quality and suitability of the existing infrastructure stock, what are the agency's priorities as they see them, particularly out over the period to 10 years. In developing the top-down approach, we will look at this through a scenario planning and vision setting approach. And the development of those scenarios is something which we're working on right now. And as we work through this consultation phase and through the longer period of the development of the strategy, we'll be engaging with the community about what those scenarios might best be. And as you can imagine, in the post-COVID world, the scenarios will be a lot different than what we even thought just a few months ago. And then how do we prioritise everything we see from the bottom up and the top down approach? Well, we'll refer back to the objectives and the principles. We'll make sure we have a program which is affordable, and we'll make sure we have a program where it is actually implementable. So, and one of the key features in that will be, do we have the right skills to develop the project in a cost-effective manner? So my final slide is a slide which just seeks to whet your appetite about what are we asking of you right now. Well, through the discussion paper, there are 22 targeted questions, and we're encouraging you to respond to these either online or in whichever way you find the most convenient. And as I said, we'll be moving across the community. So the opportunity of speaking directly with us, we look forward to that as well. And all of this in the period out to the 21st of August. We're also going to be canvassing opinions via a survey, and we're talking about infrastructure for the future. So it's important for us to capture all the voices, including those of tomorrow's infrastructure users. That is the young component of our population. And again, I encourage you to look at our website for this. We're about to kick off a statewide roadshow where we'll all be workshopping a range of considerations that will need to factor into the next stage of the strategy's development. As I mentioned, we're going to be visiting all the 10 regions, plus hosting a number of these discussions online. And just in closing, can I say, we're always happy to hear from people directly or through group discussions. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us through the website or, as I said, in whichever form you find most convenient. Thank you, Adrian.
Thanks very much, John. We've got a few questions have come through already, so I'd just encourage everybody who's playing along from their offices or homes to make sure you get your questions through so that we do have the opportunity to answer them later on. We'll now move to our panel discussion. So joining John on that panel will be Nicole Lockwood, Lance Glare and Marion Fulker. John, I might just come to you first. You had a slide in your presentation which had the 10 objectives that you'll be looking to address through the development process. Is there a unifying theme that sort of sits across those, something that brings this all together for you?
The Act does, I think, Adrian. The Act requires us to look at, as I mentioned, the economic, the social and environmental objectives of the infrastructure program. That, I think, is probably the most unifying aspect of it. The other component of the objectives is this is the first time we've ever developed a 20-year strategy, a comprehensive strategy across all areas of the state, across all sectors. And we are very genuine in saying we do want to reach across all sectors and all regions of the state. And the objectives, we think, actually do reach to those two key criteria. That is, make sure it is a comprehensive strategy and make sure it is highly collaborated. So I think the Act and just our desire to get something to achieve something through this study that everybody will see is inclusive, that people's opinions have been taken account of, and the plan is something which we can actually implement.
Thanks. Marion, I might come to you next. Infrastructure Australia, you're on the board. It's currently developing the next iteration of the Australian Infrastructure Plan. The first one was in 2016. The next one will be released in 2021. As a member of IA's board and also an independent representative based in WA, what are your initial reflections on those objectives, the intent of the discussion paper, and how that might fit with the work that you're doing right now at Infrastructure Australia?
Thanks, Adrian, and good morning, everyone. Firstly, congratulations on actually getting this paper out the door. I was one of the reviewers some months ago, and I know how much work and effort has got into getting everything this far. Adrian, from my perspective, the strategic and collaborative approach, there's no doubt in my mind that it will result in a very robust 20-year state infrastructure strategy, the inaugural one. And so many voices in the community have been calling for this for such a long time. So the fact that we would have a pipeline that's depoliticised around the sort of infrastructure we need But I think the expansive remit is very important. So as John mentioned, going way beyond the sort of traditional roads and transport type builds, and including social and affordable housing, arts and culture, sport and entertainment, and obviously the new wave, the digital economy and telecommunications. So it takes a very contemporary approach in the discussion paper to getting feedback that's just going to be so wide ranging, and as John said, with a particular emphasis on hearing from the regions. But what I also like is the non-build options being included as well, looking at governance, procurement and skills. So from an IA perspective, we congratulate IWA on the launch of this discussion paper, and we're ready, willing and able to be part of the discussion as they will be in developing the Australian Infrastructure Plan over the next 12 months.
Thanks, Marion. I might just try and delve into the discussion paper a bit and maybe come to John and Lance on this. So you're broken into 3 timeframes, the sort of short, medium and long term over that 20-year period. What do you see as the benefits of splitting into those timeframes, and how do you avoid being captured, I guess, by the here and now, by the short-term trends, dare I say, by the impact of COVID when you're talking about a sort of 2-decade horizon? John, we'll come to you first and then go to Lance.
Well, I think the structure is quite a sensible structure. We have a very strong view that we're not going to delve into what I call the forward estimates of the budget process. We have a very capable set of people who deal with that forward estimate period, and they're looking at a range of measures now as we both, particularly Western Australia, moves out of this COVID environment and hopefully on a sustainable basis. The real interest we have from Infrastructure WA's point of view is to create a discussion across our community about what does the medium-term requirement for infrastructure require. So leave aside this immediate period. What's the period particularly from years 4 to 10 look like from a bottom-up approach? And then what does the period from 11 to 20 look like? And as I mentioned, from a top-down approach. So it's to me, a logical structuring. We have a very good understanding with the government agencies that we won't get involved in the shovel-ready projects. There are other processes for that. But what we want to have a discussion, and this is the whole focus of the discussion paper, is we want to have a discussion across the community about what does this medium term look like. And from what we can gather in terms of the anticipation we hear, in terms of the feedback, the community seems very ready for this discussion.
Thanks. And Lance, that challenge of planning in a radically uncertain future and therefore not being captured by the short term, what's your perspective?
Thanks, Adrian. I think these sorts of exercises always have to grapple with uncertainty. If you're looking at 20 years, nobody can really tell for sure what the world is going to look like over that sort of time period. In the discussion paper, we ask people to take their mind back to the year 2000, and nobody could have seen the millennial mining boom coming. We think back to things like September 11. It seems like a lifetime ago. So if we're looking forward to 2040, very hard to tell. That's why we're going down a scenario planning path and having a baseline scenario, but also some variations to that. Look, I think the economic impacts and certainly some of the health impacts of COVID are very important and will take time to work through. As John said, though, what we're particularly interested in is what are some of the enduring shifts going to look like coming out of something like COVID? So, what is the working arrangements, for example, going to look like over the medium term? Is that something that's going to come and go, or is that something that's going to stay with us into the future? Those planning horizons, I think, also just probably make sense in terms of the way that government and government agencies work. A lot of agencies do plan out to the 10-year time horizon. So that's why we've targeted that time frame, particularly around future projects and programs of work.
Thanks, Lance. There's a number of questions have come through on the chat, which is on a teleprompter to my side, which is why I'm looking over there, and they chime quite closely with one of the questions that I was going to ask, which is, I guess probably to Nicole first. There are common challenges in infrastructure across the country, of course, and they're unique in each jurisdiction. Nicole, you've been involved with Infrastructure Australia. You've had the opportunity to observe state infrastructure strategies from right around the country in the way they've developed. I'd be interested to know how you've fed those into your work and input into the discussion paper. Similar questions have been asked by Lee Rosetto from Inter-Ellison, Leanne Copping from Bugside, Toby Hill from In8. All have said, what's the advantages of coming after the other states? What have you learned from those experiences, either involved directly or looking from afar?
Thanks, Adrian, and certainly personally, it's absolutely delightful to be at this point. We're actually getting a strategy developed for WA, because I've been a lone voice for a long time with a lot of support, but finally getting to the point now where we're actually getting on that journey. And I'll say that we're fast followers, maybe, rather than the last of the queue. But the benefit of that is you do get to learn from other jurisdictions, look at how their processes have worked. And, there's a lot that's shifted over the last sort of 10 to 12, 15 years, I suppose, since this iBody landscape was created. I think we've got the benefit of the language and the discipline around long-term planning and business case development is certainly far more evolved than it was when I first joined Infrastructure Australia. I think we are all different, and I think COVID itself has painted a very interesting picture of how each state operates, its strengths and weaknesses, and how we take the best of that. And I think that's probably only going to continue to be reinforced as we recover from the pandemic. But one of the things I think that WA does sit quite differently in is around our regional landscape. So we have a very big state, which is an opportunity and also a threat in some ways, and a risk. We're not heavily populated across the whole state. So how do we make sure that we, as John has pointed out, hear from everybody? We've understood the strengths of that whole landscape, but we've also thought about how do we create a more sustainable landscape for the whole of the state into the future, rather than continuing to focus entirely on Perth and having the other parts of the state maybe trail behind. The other thing I think that's quite distinct in Western Australia is the level of private sector investment. So we certainly need to understand the private sector space. We need to make sure that government investment is enabling that. And when we've got such a large construction and mining sector as part of our economic base, really making sure that in that non-build side, the policy and the regulatory solutions, we're making sure that government understands how they can continue to enable infrastructure delivery, because they aren't the only answer.
Thanks. I might come to Lance just to follow up on this question. Lance, you undertook a big exercise in the process when you were with Premier and Cabinet Department about how you set up Infrastructure WA, and I know that was a big exercise in looking at experiences in other jurisdictions in New Zealand and around the world. Is there anything you took from that process that's informed both doing a discussion paper and then the subsequent strategy?
Yeah, sure. I think there's certainly been a lot of learnings from what's occurred around the country and other places as well. Certainly for us, the model that we've gone for is one that is trying to be very relevant, that is seeking to plug in to the workings of government, but also balance that with appropriate independence and a variety of private sector voices around the table as well. So look, there are a lot of things and a lot of challenges, a lot of opportunities that we share with other jurisdictions, things like population growth, population change, climate change, funding considerations and those sorts of things. I would probably re-echo a number of Nicole's points. Just coming to that one, which I think is particularly unique with Western Australia, and we do go into it a little in the document. It's something that we certainly saw during the last mining boom, just the enormous scale and proportion of private sector investment that can occur at different times in Western Australia. During the mining boom, it was sitting at around about 90-10 split between private sector and government. At the moment, that's probably sitting more at around 80-20. but that can have enormous implications for the cost of building public infrastructure in this state, and also the availability of resources and skills.
I might just dive down into that theme and ask the whole panel if one would like to volunteer to answer. What sort of feedback are you looking for from the attendees on today's call and in the listening you're doing in the regions about how you unlock that potential in the regions? How do you change the balance Nicole spoke about away from a sort of a Perth-centric perspective to a broader regional one, and what can people best do to help you answer those questions? I don't know if one of you'd like to volunteer. I'll just nominate if someone doesn't volunteer. We'll maybe go to the top. John, what's your view?
Well, look, thanks. It's an issue which we've been having discussions with the regions already about. The discussion we want to see across the whole of the state is what's the infrastructure which, to use the old saying, which raises all the boats? What's the infrastructure which lifts this economy and grows the community and sustains the environment in a way that will be of benefit to everybody? Now, it sounds grandiose, but it's the theme of what we're trying to develop in this discussion with the regions. Now, what that means is, if you sort of put it bluntly, we don't want to necessarily look at where the local school is, but we want to have a look at what is going to be the education need across the state. And similarly across all service delivery of a public sector nature. And that's really extensive. And when you look, for instance, at major transport developments across the region, major energy developments across the region, one of the things which we are particularly alert to is the need to ensure we've got sustainable water supply. Even in the south of our state, which, over the long history of Western Australia hasn't had water shortages, but now is facing that harsh reality. And we want to grow the populations through these regions, particularly through the south. But how do you sustain the water stock? And that's one of the critically important issues. And they're the sort of discussions which we want to have with the community. So not the minutiae, not the small detail planning, it's the bigger picture considerations which we've got in mind.
And Adrian, maybe if I can jump in at that point, I think the other part to that is really understanding from the people that live in the regions, or the people that aspire to live in the regions, what does that lifestyle look like, and what are their expectations about how that would evolve over time. I think what we know to be true globally, and Marion's done a lot of work on this, is that the trend is actually back to metros, unless we've got a very strong economic base in a regional area. So what's the formula to really reinforcing and diversifying or strengthening those economic hubs if they're not, where they are strong in the regions? But how do we make sure, as John says, that sort of the regional, the infrastructure backbone that's actually going to support long-term development is there, so it's not this sort of reactive window dressing on an ongoing basis. It's actually looking at systemic improvement over time. And we all know, if we want to have a debate about geopolitical issues, we've got a massive footprint of land. We've got a portion of the state where a lot of the in terms of lifestyle and climate and all those sorts of things that we say, oh, we wouldn't want to live there. Well, there's a lot of parts of the world that would want to live there. How do we make this appealing to the rest of the globe in a way that's actually going to strengthen WA?
I might just try and draw together a couple of themes there, Nicole. I'll maybe bring Marion in alongside you, Nicole, on this. You spoke about that historical trend towards urbanisation and a metro type lifestyle. Clearly COVID-19 has a dramatic impact and an immediate impact on the way people work, and perhaps the willingness to travel, and the viability of platforms like the one we're using now as a replacement for face-to-face, and that may have an impact on perhaps regionalisation. My question, I guess, is how do you guard against an overreaction to thinking that that's the new future versus that sort of 20, 30, 50 years of trend data on urbanisation? I think, Marion, perhaps with your day job hat on as CEO of Committee for Perth, it might be one to come to you on first. How do we get this balance right, particularly when you're talking about a 20-year planning horizon in a document like the one IWA are producing?
Well, I mean, Lance rightly said at the beginning, this sort of population prediction, even just the overall number for Australia, let alone where the patterns will be across the country. But, you know, certainly the trend has been towards globalisation, and, you know, cities have become brands in their own right, well beyond countries and provinces. And as we're sitting down at the IA board table and thinking about the Australian Infrastructure Plan, one of our key considerations is this decanting of population for quality of life, because some of our bigger cities are not as high on the livability and affordability scale as they have been. So certainly there's employment there, but there hasn't been other aspects. So I think it does need to be taken into consideration. You would have possibly seen last week that the Regional Australia Institute released a report that was very much crowing about people wanting to move back to the regions for quality of life and affordability, and they can telecommute to work. So it's a sort of fascinating dimension as we think about long-term planning, because we're probably not going to go back to pre-COVID ways in a hard and fast rule.
Nicole, I don't know if you wanted to dive in on any of the subjects there.
Well, I think the difficulty with this is it requires a vision change. And when I was in the Pilbara and we were trying to create 50,000 people in Pilbara cities, and we're talking to the state demographer about the trends, they're trying to give us data that shows us what we used to do and projects it forward. So the only way you can do this and actually change the trend is intervene in some way. So it requires either a government to make a policy decision that they want a different future than what we've had. And I think one of the benefits of this exercise, if we do nothing else, if we paint forward what our current planning is going to deliver to us, if we do nothing differently, I think that in itself will be a fascinating exercise, because it may be that it's taking us in a direction that we actually don't want to go. So if government is, or if as a community we really do want to see this happen, there's got to be a step change in the way we do what we do. We've got to think differently. You know, at the moment we're even having a debate about whether Bunbury is our second city. You know, we haven't even got to that level yet, which should be a no-brainer. And you look at the way we're populated, we have enough infrastructure there for it to be, but what's holding it back? So I think we need an honest conversation about what's been happening and what we need to do differently to make it, make that 20 or 50-year horizon quite different than what we're planning for right now.
So just on that point, John, do you see the state infrastructure strategy that you're producing that will come off the back of this discussion paper as that potentially that vehicle for intervention to change the direction? Is that your sort of your objective through this?
Well, over a 20-year plan, we wanted, if you like, postulate how the state could develop and with a larger population. And one thing that is certain is once we get through this COVID situation, Western Australia will continue to grow. And we've had over all the years since we were founded, steady population growth, normally above the national average. So, you know, how do we accommodate that population growth across the regions, and how do we see the regions develop in a sustainable way? So, yeah, look, I think it's a clear opportunity for us to put a few suggestions to the community and specifically to government to say, these are some of the things which you might want to consider. You can call them interventions if you like. These are some of the things you might want to consider in the development of infrastructure, which will accommodate a larger population, which will see new economic activity developed across the state, which either could be thought of today, but just seems to be a reach too far, or even issues which haven't been thought of at all. And I'm kind of hoping that through this process and this process of consultation, we really do both identify those projects and programs of infrastructure which will see that economic development, which at the moment we might think is a step too far, but more particularly, what's some of the stuff which we aren't thinking of now? My mind goes to the digital side of infrastructure, and how can we keep growing the digital side of infrastructure provision and public sector service delivery in a way which people would say, gee, this has really improved my quality of life. And if we can do something like that, then I think we're making a difference. And one thing I can assure everybody about, we're determined here to make a difference.
Excellent. Well, that's a good call to action. I thought what we might do is now open up to Q&A from the audience. But before we do that, we wanted to launch a poll question for today's session, which will pop up on everybody's screen shortly. The question we're asking is, which areas should IWA place the most focus on for its first 20-year strategy? And then we've listed a number of options there. You can choose up to 3, and that poll will launch shortly when my team launches it. I think it should be coming to you now. Hopefully that's popped up on everybody's screens. While we work on getting that poll to you, and we've got answers coming in already, I've got a few questions have come through. I'm going to go to one from Brian Norris from WSP first. He's asked for the panel's view on how your organisation and the strategy can help transport agencies develop solutions that are better integrated. And more broadly, how do you see Infrastructure WA's forward role evolving as a coordinator of WA agencies and bringing the private sector into decision making? So a multi-clause question, but I think the general thrust there is about better integration of planning around transport. Do we have a volunteer to answer that one?
Adrian, can I lead off on that? Because I think that's a really important question. And one of the things I'd like to emphasise is we will be in the development of this plan as good as the information we get from everybody who we're going to collaborate with, most particularly the public sector agencies, but equally from across the community. Where we will add real value, where Infrastructure WA will add real value, is bringing together all of the plans of the agencies and all of the identified needs from across the community, and putting all of that together in an integrated and, if I could say, coherent form. Often across a 20-year time frame, there will be plans of an agency of government which don't align with the plans of another agency. And what we will be seeking to do is to make sure that alignment is as good as we can make it. Hasn't been done before over a 20-year period, but that to me is where one of the great strengths of Infrastructure WA can be found. So we're not going to recreate the wheel, particularly as we look from the bottom up, but we certainly want to make sure the 4 wheels of the cart are rotating in a line.
And Adrian, can I just chime here in terms of, then this is where the fact that now every state has an IA body and there's regular meetings between the chairs and the CEOs, and there's a joint program of work. So, WA strategy won't be sitting in isolation to the nation. And Nicole Lockwood and her role that she's done with the Freight and Logistics Council, you could, during the toilet paper crisis, you could get it to the border and you couldn't get it any further. So I think we realised that we're not a state that can sit within an island in an island. We do actually need that connectivity to the rest of Australia.
Nicole?
Yeah, and I think, look, the other part to that, again, is a bit learnings from COVID. One of the things that really struck me, we talk a lot about transport planning and transport almost leading the discussion. All we did was tell everyone not to go to work for a little while, and suddenly our transport system looked quite different. So, when you think about what does an infrastructure strategy do, well, it looks at the whole system. It doesn't look at one part. And I think one of the things we're really going to have to challenge ourselves around is the answer building more concrete, or actually is it changing some policies and some behaviour? Because when I looked around our network that we were 3 months before talking about at breaking point, it actually had a fair bit of capacity. And I think that's what governments are going to have to get a little bit more creative about going forward.
Thanks, Nicole. So I've got a question from Scilla de Lacy, Mayor of Netherlands. Said, I'm pleased to hear the discussion around an emphasis on services, not assets. How do you currently envisage the strategy being able to assess those non-build options against build options? How do you prioritise those different choices? And if Lance, maybe you'd like to tackle that one.
Sure, thanks, Adrian, and a fantastic question, and probably an area that we don't always think enough about. But sometimes it won't be one versus another. There will be a whole range of non-build solutions that just make good sense to do. And it's not that we either build something or we don't build something. It might mean, for example, a better way of doing procurement, or a better governance model, or some policy settings. But I think also in this space, it's really important to look at how we can get more out of the infrastructure that we already have, where there is forecast demand that's going to exceed the capacity of what we've got. That could be in a rail network, it could be in a road network, it could be in an energy network, a whole range of different types of infrastructure there. And often what we find is that the use of things like technology or the use of policy settings and those type of initiatives can increase the capacity of that infrastructure considerably at relatively low cost. At the moment, Western Australia is just putting the finishing touches on one of our first smart freeways, which is one example of what we're talking about here. Smarter signalling systems on rail networks. They're not cheap by any stretch, but if you compare them with duplicating an entire rail line, the cost of that is a lot less. So I think those sorts of options will absolutely be on the table. They will be the sorts of things that we will be looking at and looking at how we can solve some of these issues in the most cost-effective way.
Thanks, Ant. I want to go to a question from Silvano Giordano from the Willarara Creative in the Goldfield Esperance region. How do you plan to I'm going to come to John on this. How do you plan to meaningfully engage with remote communities, particularly First Nations communities, in development of the strategy?
Well, we're going to visit a few. That will be part of our plan. And we are planning on visiting all the regions, and in visiting those regions, hopefully we'll be able to reach out, particularly to communities which are, more remote. A bit hard at this stage in terms of the COVID restrictions, but nevertheless, over the period of the study, we'll find a way. To the extent we can't do it physically, Adrian, we'll find a way of seeking responses from those communities. Most of these communities are well represented, so we'll seek out the representatives. And the machinery of government also has a very good understanding of what the needs are across our broad community. So we'll be relying on those agencies of government to assist us as well. It's one of our key objectives that we need to ensure we have appropriate infrastructure which looks after the well-being of all of our communities, but particularly our Aboriginal communities who do live in very remote communities, and they have to be part of the strategy. So we'll find a way, recognising that there are many of these communities and that they are, quite dispersed.
Thanks, John. Bill Grace from the Australian Urban Design Research Centre said, what role do you see private finance playing in future investment in the state? And there's a follow-up question as well, which I'll hold off on for a moment. But that role of private finance in delivery of infrastructure, I think this is referring specifically to public infrastructure rather than privately funded infrastructure. I don't know, Nicole, if you perhaps wanted to go
Yeah,
first.
sure. Well, I think one of the benefits of doing a strategy like this is it creates some visibility to the private market about what the intent of government is. So, there's a couple of parts to this. One is a policy position of the government of the day as to how they want to fund and finance and deliver infrastructure, and that will shift depending on where that government sits on that issue. But I think as particularly off the back of recovery efforts of COVID start to play out, the government purse is only going to get tighter. And I think governments are increasingly understanding the need to find ways to leverage other funding sources. That doesn't mean it has to be a sale of an outright asset. It can be ways of partnering that allow the government still to set the direction and have some level of control, particularly for common user assets. So I think it's an opportunity, probably through necessity, to have a broader conversation about what that partnership looks like, and the ability for the private sector to understand the pipeline ahead of time, to give some thought to what that model might look like, I think will bring a richer conversation to government rather than this sort of all or nothing approach that we've had in the past.
Well, Nicole, I'm glad that I came to you with that question, because you provided a perfect segue to the follow-up question, which is again from Silla de Lacy from the Mayor of Netherlands. So to what extent do you think the strategy will examine the application of a user pays principle, particularly given the emphasis of that in Infrastructure Australia's work through the Australian Infrastructure Plan and all of its work before then? And Nicole, I'll come to you first, but now I'll perhaps go to Marion, given her current role on the IA board.
Well, I must admit, it is a little entrenched in me that you've got to start there, because, you know, we can't assume that the government's a charity and it will just provide infrastructure indefinitely. I think there are a lot of parts of our system that need a rethink, because we actually all pay. It's just the visibility of how we pay and the structures we use. So we as a body at IWA haven't had that debate yet, and I think it's one we will start to have as we flesh out the discussion paper. But you know, how we achieve the outcomes, I think again we're going to have to get more willing to look at the whole system rather than just assuming that government funding is the way to go.
And Marion?
Well, Infrastructure Australia's put out over the years some reform papers to really get to the heart of some of these user pays and the sort of hidden taxes versus the very direct taxes. And as a country, we just haven't really been up for that debate. And before we started today, we were talking and joking about toll roads. Now, something that's in many states in Australia, it's written in Infrastructure Australia documents saying that, you know, governments should look at what money that they can raise first before putting out their hand to the federal government. So I imagine it's going to be an issue we're going to have to discuss in Western Australia, even if we don't want to.
Thanks, Marion. What I might do is bring our poll to a close. We've had well over 300 votes on it. So I think this is statistically significant, and you can put it as an input into your development. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results now. It should pop up on everybody's screen. The question we asked is, which areas should IWA place the most focus for its first 20-year strategy? And I don't know if our panelists have seen those results come up, but there's a fairly overwhelming winner there on economic growth and diversification, but also a number of fairly popular options around there with visibility of future projects and programs. The regional development piece comes through strongly as well. John, any major takeouts? Can you see the results there?
Yep. Well, thank you everybody for your indications, and this is the beginning of our consultation phase. So, look, I think my take out of this, Adrian, is it's quite distributed. That is, even though economic growth and diversification has got the most number of votes, equally there are a range of areas here which people are seeing we ought to place priority, and that doesn't surprise me. I mean, we do see this as being quite a diverse set of considerations which we will bring to the development of the strategy. As I said in my opening comments, the economic piece of it will be one of the key pieces, but equally we have to look at the social environmental. We have to look at the regional developments, and these are being reflected in all areas. On asset management, interestingly, probably a little lower than the rest. One of the objectives of our remit is we have to have a look at the existing infrastructure stock and make sure we're actually getting the best value out of that existing infrastructure stock. That goes to the whole range of questions, including just maintenance of infrastructure. I think we've got a fair bit of work to do in that area across our community. So again, even though it was at the lower end of the range here, a big issue for us to consider.
Lance, I might just, given there is a fairly even split across these different options, and I'm sure if we'd put another 20 options on there, there would have been an evenness as well. How do you avoid in developing the strategy that it just becomes so diverse, such a catch-all that it sort of becomes meaningless as a result? I think we've seen that across a number of plans and infrastructure strategies across a number of years in other jurisdictions, that they just become so big and cumbersome and trying to deal with so many problems that they fail to tackle any of them. How are you going to avoid that?
Yeah, it's a really good one. Look, I think all of these issues are important, and that's really what I get from this poll. Some of them, for the times that we're living in right now, I think people would see as even more important than others. And I think the thing to remember with this 20-year strategy, it does need to look out 20 years. but it only has a maximum shelf life of 5 years. So it'll get refreshed and renewed within 5 years or less. So really what we need to do here is craft a strategy that is fit for the times that we're in now, looking ahead 20 years. The economic growth and diversification one, with that in mind, is absolutely no surprise. I think the message for us here would be we do need to look at all of these objectives, all of these issues. The reality is, in a single strategy that has a shelf life of 5 years, you're not going to be able to do equal justice to everything at the same time. So we are going to have to necessarily focus on some issues and areas more than others. That doesn't necessarily mean that other areas and objectives get completely overlooked and ignored, but we do need to put our focus around some of the highest priorities out of all of this, and then come back and look at that again in 5 years' time, see what's moved on, and things might have changed. I think the other thing here is we're required by our legislation to consider the affordability of our recommendations. So we can't just come up with a totally aspirational wish list of recommendations to put to government. It has to be grounded with a sense of reality. It has to be affordable as well.
Thanks, Lance. I'm going to do one final question. Nick Warland from Property Council WA has asked, the discussion paper talks about challenging conventional thinking on infrastructure related issues. He's interested to know how the panel envisages what this will look like in the strategy. I'm going to slightly bastardise Nick's question. I'm going to go to each of the panel members and ask them in one sentence, what area would you really like to see the work challenge a conventional area of thinking on infrastructure? I'll come to Mariam first on that one.
Well, I think this is the beauty of all of the iBodies coming together, because we are challenging each other, and already there's a program of work to do things better, more strategically, and open up the infrastructure conversation that little bit more broadly. And I think we're all up for that.
And Lance, what the one area to challenge convention for you?
Look, I think the regional development one is going to be key, and the role that infrastructure has to play in that. It's something that we've wanted to do for many years, haven't been as successful as we would have liked to have been. So this is an opportunity to have a look at it.
Nicole?
I think looking at infrastructure as a system and actually understanding how each piece interplays with the other and what that means for the long term, rather than just looking at each sector on its own.
And the last word to the chair.
We'll keep developing the mosaic. The digital component, and how do we enhance the digital connectivity across the state with traditional infrastructure to improve service delivery? I think that's where it's really exciting.
Right, it's a great note to finish on. I think it's a very good note when it's delivered over a Zoom video conference nationally to well over 500 people. So thank you very much to our panel today for reflecting on the launch of the State Infrastructure Strategy discussion paper by Infrastructure WA. Thank you once again to the panel. Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at a future virtual event.